Hi, my name is Michael Lavara, and this is a presentation I've compiled based on some testing I've performed over the last week on two different fuels in the aviation world. There have been reports of several aircraft with paint deterioration after use of G100UL on public forums. And there's been concerns expressed in the aviation community about the fuel's composition and possible effects on paint and aircraft materials, including fuel components. I was made aware of an aircraft at Reed Hillview Airport that was reporting similar issues after fueling up with G100UL, and I personally inspected the aircraft on December 15th. That set me off on this research presented herein. Why am I interested in this, and why did I do this testing? I'm a pilot and aircraft owner at Reed Hillview Airport in Santa Clara County, and for the past 3 years, I've been unable to fill my aircraft at its home base with 100 octane fuel because of the county's ban on 100 low lead. This has caused me to make diversions and unnecessary fuel stops in order to refuel my aircraft so that I have fuel for my next trip. I certainly would desire 100 octane fuel. As an owner and an AMP, I wanted to understand potential adverse effects before making a choice to utilize this new fuel in two personal aircraft by way of a major alteration under an STC, or in one case, possibly a field approval due to the engine designation not being on the AML as modified by the STC. Much of the criticism on the internet has been surrounded by, well, what was the condition of the paint before issues appeared? As they say in aviation, trust but verify. So I set off and designed an experiment to look at this for myself. These are some of the forum posts that kind of got a lot of this going the last few weeks. There's a couple Moonies that have reported paint issues. There's a guy on a backcountry forum who's also said he had some staining that didn't take long to occur. So there's a lot of interest in this new fuel, and even AbWeb picked up the story on it. What you see here is a Cessna 421 twin aircraft based at Reed Hillview that got the GAMI STC. The owner reported that he had no prior issues of staining on his wings on the lower and upper surfaces shown here. He topped the tanks once with the 50-50 mix of G100UL and 100 low lead based on what was already in the tanks, and noticed this about 2 weeks later on the lower and upper surfaces of his wing. After personally inspecting the Cessna 421, I decided that I was going to test for myself whether the G100UL was compatible with my own aircraft. Having seen the Cessna 421 and the discussion on the internet, I set off to do compatibility testing of fuel and painted surfaces, do the same with installed components, O-rings, or other items in the fuel system, and do this by putting both items, two identical ones in 100 low lead and G100UL, and use actual components from my aircraft or ones that are specified in the manual. So what did the test plan look like? I utilized components from two personal aircraft. First was a previously removed trim tab from a Citabria and spare inspection plate covers on the wing. On a Cessna 182, I temporarily removed two inspection covers from the upper side of the flaps. I acquired G100UL from Watsonville's pump on the 15th of December and drained 100 low lead from a flying aircraft on the same day. I tested some typically installed O-rings, including fuel-resistant O-rings, and I performed this testing in a garage in California, which essentially is like a hangar. The temps were varied, and there was no atmospheric controls for this, and this was over about a week duration. So the test started on December 15th after looking at the 421. I simulated spillage of 100 low lead and G100UL on a surface, which was the previously removed trim tab, to kind of compare the individual effects. And what you can see here is in the top before testing and on the bottom after starting to apply both fuels in section 1. Note that I did chip away some of the loose paint around the trim tab and then started to look at the results. So after applying a bit of fuel to each surface with a rag, I noticed over time that the 100 low lead evaporated quickly and the G100UL seemed to remain for a lot longer period, along with smearing the Sharpie. So after about 2 hours of testing, which included a couple applications of lightly brushing fuel on each section of the trim tab, I noticed that there were brown stains left by G100UL. The Sharpie was more blurred than 100 low lead. The paint started to get soft on the trailing edge where it had pooled. And this resulted in either fingerprints, a little bit of scratching at my fingernail, or slight color left on a rag when I wiped it. At this point, I had noticed something else interesting. Both 100 low lead and G100UL had dripped down the side of the mason jar from when I applied it with a rag, and the G100UL had marred the surface of my flammable cabinet, while 100 low lead had not. To be fair, GAMI does point out that you should clean up any fuel spilled on the surface within 1 to 3 minutes, or you might leave stains. It was time to move on to testing inspection plate covers. For this test, I decided to put two identical painted parts, one with 100 low lead and one with G100UL, in separate containers, and exposed them to two different scenarios. The first was to kind of submerge it in a closed environment where the lid's on the container. The second was to remove the lid and then let the fuel evaporate and see the effects of that with a time-lapse camera. These are the inspection plate covers used for testing. Note on the left, the 100 low lead version has a disadvantage with paint chipped and cracked, whereas on the right is the G100 UL, which had very small blemishes around the center of the rivets and on the right side. Here's where the testing started by applying about 1 ounce to each cover, and it would roll off the cover and pool in the bottom of the container and leave a little bit of fuel around. I would apply the covers shortly thereafter and occasionally slosh the fuel around each container to kind of simulate a spill that would roll off. Again, this is in a closed environment. Next morning, I removed the lids on each container and could not really see any issues with 100 low lead. And on G100 UL, it looked pretty good, but maybe starting to notice an issue along one of the paint cracks. So on December 17th, at about 35 hours in, I started to notice some changes here. The 100 low lead seemed to have no real issues, maybe just some highlighting around the paint cracks. Whereas the G100 UL fairing started to peel up in the center around the rivets and on the right side where the one existing crack was. At this point in testing, I removed the lids and allowed the fuel to evaporate on the surface to mimic what would happen with a spill outside or a slow drip maybe from a drain. I'd come by occasionally, slosh the fuel around on each fairing, or add more if it evaporated in about a half ounce to an ounce at a time. As you can see here, you can see the fuel evaporating in the time lapse. And the G100 UL tends to pool more fuel and not evaporate as much. Now, whether that was purely the remnants or a concentrate from the main alkylate, because the alkylate had evaporated, I'm not sure. But what you can see here is a little bit of blue dye on the 100 low lead that would disappear when it sloshed. But the results here at 36 hours show that the fairing really started to degrade in G100 UL. Continuing on, still no issues with the 100 low lead fairing. I tried hard to look at it, but look at the time lapse on the right side. The G100 UL is starting to grow. So here we are, 48 hours, 2 days, and the right side fairing is starting to really peel away on G100 UL. At this point, I'll go silent and let you watch the time-lapse video for a few seconds. So here we are about 3 days in, and the difference in the two fairings is quite remarkable. 100 low lead, I'm really stretching to find any issues with and degradation, whereas the G100 UL inspection plate cover paint has really severely degraded. So as you can see, the side-by-side testing shows that 100 low lead did little if anything to the paint, while G100 UL had weakened the paint significantly. So the summary from the first aircraft's test was that the inspection plate covers had significant negative effects from G100 UL, whereas testing with 100 low lead did not. The Citabria is a fabric aircraft and inspection plate covers are metal. The aircraft's painted with butyrate dope, and I don't have any information on logs as to exactly what enamel paint was used on those fairings. So I had a few other inspection panel covers laying around of unknown paint origin, so I applied G100 UL to them occasionally over the week, with varying results. The red cover was the most resilient and took a while for it to deteriorate along the edges where I had put some scratches. And again, I don't know any of the composition of the paint in these fairings. They could be from spray can or some other aviation paint. One of the other compatibility tests I ran was taking a leftover part from an RV-8 project that was primered with self-etching primer. It took several days, but as you can see here, the primer did start to soften and I could rub it off with my hand. It does seem like the primer is pretty resilient overall and takes some time for it to be compromised. So now it's time to move on to testing aircraft number 2, which is the Cessna 182. This test skipped the kind of partial submersion and went direct to the spilling fuel on top of the surfaces. For this test, I chose to remove 2 inspection plate covers from the left-hand flap of the Cessna 182. They're near the inner flap track and located directly behind the fuel cap on the aircraft, so they could potentially see fuel if fuel spilled. The inspection plate covers have generally also been protected from the elements, since when the flaps are in their retracted position, they're not generally in direct contact with UV light, so I considered them an exemplar example to start with. So it'd be fair to say in the Citabria test, I didn't know the exact paint on those fairings. In this case, I do. The aircraft was refinished around 2005, and this was painted with an industry standard paint, Sherwin-Williams Jet Glow Matterhorn White. This is a very well-known paint, is very resilient, and I thought would be a great test against the fuels. This is the inspection plate cover about to be subjected to 100 low lead. You can see the front and back. Pretty normal paint application, a little bit of dust in it and marks around the screw holes. And the G100 UL is in similar condition, about to be exposed to fuel. On December 20th at 10:30 a.m., I started subjecting the Cessna inspection plates to 100 low lead and G100 UL respectively. It took about 14 hours before I noticed the edges of the inspection plate on the right side starting to lift when subjected to G100 UL. Occasionally gave it a little douse of fuel in each container. These plates are elevated on the little plastic containers they're in, so there's fuel pooling on the sides. I'd estimate over the course of 2 days, I applied 5 or 6 ounces of 100 low lead and G100 UL respectively in each container to see the results that you've got. The 100 low lead almost completely evaporates and leaves a little bit of a blue dye, which does wash off, and the G100 UL has seemed to pool on the edges and leave maybe a concentrate or some things that are not the alkylate behind. The perspective here for the time lapse has changed a little bit as I reconfigured things, but the G100 UL exposed Cessna 182 inspection plate continues to deteriorate. You'll notice at top of this photo is a gray piece of fabric from an AT6 that had been cut off a surface. I started testing that, and I'll see if there's any results, but at this point I'm going to conclude testing on my aircraft's components. These are the Cessna 182 inspection plate covers after about 3 days exposure of their respective fuels. Note that 100 low lead continues to evaporate quickly, and the G100 UL pools in the edges of the container. And as noted in previous observations, the blue stains left over from 100 low lead are easily removed by sloshing fuel or other means. So the test results from the Cessna 182 inspection plate covers yielded negative effects from the application of G100 UL to a well-known normal aircraft quality paint, whereas the 100 low lead did not affect those inspection panel covers the same. So these are 20 years old, really good condition, out of the UV light, and I quite frankly think these are a normal aircraft paint that should not have been affected by application of fuel. What I'm highlighting here is a post by the creator of G100 UL stating that G100 UL avgas is not a threat to normal aircraft paint. I wanted to point out that when I started testing the trim tab, the inspection cover plates in the Citabria, and the Cessna 182 inspection plates, these 32-ounce mason jars were essentially full of fluid. Right now, about 8 ounces remain in each, so equal parts were poured onto the respective parts over the duration of this test. I mentioned earlier I wanted to test some of the wetted fuel system components. Specifically, I don't have extra bladders to test. I don't have extra wing hose rubber interconnects. I don't have cork gaskets for my fuel senders or other things in the fuel system. But what I do have are O-rings that would typically be used in your primer or fuel selector. And I threw in for good measure one from a brake caliper, even though it's a slightly different composition. The O-rings shown here were all new, never used, sealed, and within their expiration date limits. I submerged them in containers of 100 low lead and G100 UL for a period of about 5 or 6 days before pulling them out. When I pulled out the O-rings, the differences were very noticeable just by the naked eye. As you can see here, all the G100 UL O-rings had swelled at least to 8 to 10% of their original size. And as I denoted on the ones I looked at the left, they were outside of the allowable range, and the same was true for the 2 other sets of O-rings. So what did we learn from the O-rings? Well, they did swell in the G100 UL, and they were outside of allowable limits. This was in an unconstrained test just sitting in those containers. GAMI does say in its instructions for continued airworthiness to replace O-rings with materials such as Viton where practical. And you can see the language here in the ICA. As always, one should only replace components in their aircraft that are certificated appropriately for it, whether by STC, PMA, or the manufacturer. Oh, and do you remember my flammable cabinet from earlier? When I pulled the O-rings out of their respective fuels, I cleaned them off with a towel and set them on the flammable cabinet for measurement. Several days later, I still have O-ring circular marks where the G100 infused O-rings sat, even though they had been cleaned off with a paper towel. So, what to make of all this? First off, these are my personal observations and beliefs. This was a limited test sample in scope and duration, which attempted to mimic typical use scenarios. However, the results appear to align with indications from other users' reports in the field. G100UL appears to evaporate much slower than 100 low lead and will stain the surface if not cleaned up. 100 low lead had little, if any, negative effects on the painted surfaces I tested. Immersion of painted surfaces inside a closed environment with fuel on them did not seem to have rapid degradation or significant effects. However, exposure of the painted surfaces to fuel that was left to evaporate seemed to have the most significant adverse effects and is similar to leaks in panels, fuel drains, and rivets. This leads me to believe that the main alkylate may evaporate and leaves more aggressive components of the fuel behind, which compromise the painted surfaces. It's also important to point out that it seemed like any imperfected areas allowed an entryway into the surface and may have sped up damage to the paint. We know that aircraft vary paint type, application, condition. I think your individual results may vary, but I don't think it's reasonable for owners to monitor aircraft on a daily basis. So if a small leak starts to occur, they may have damage by the time they see it in the next week or two. The standard MS nitrile series O-rings, which are fuel resistant and have worked with 100 low lead for years, are likely to have adverse effects, swelling, after exposure to G100UL. It's also an invasive and costly process for someone to perform fuel system maintenance to replace all their O-rings in the fuel system, especially when it involves draining tanks or removal fuel selector systems, which is a complex operation. Incidentally, when I pumped fuel at Watsonville, the trigger on the pump's nozzle did seem to stick and not return without some force to the off position, which almost caused me to spill fuel during the fueling operation. Immediately prior to pumping G100UL, I had used the adjacent 100 low lead pump and did not exhibit the same concerns with the fuel nozzle's handle. So whether this is a material compatibility issue or not, I don't know, but it's an important observation. On December 3rd, I was sent this photo from Reed Hillview, where they had been pumping GAMI G100UL for about a month. The one user talked to the airport ops people who said that they had a fuel truck issue. Now, these fuel trucks are new, but I have no information whether it was an issue with the truck breaking down, materials compatibility, or what the issue is. It's never been publicly stated. And the last point here is, unless the G100UL fuel I acquired and tested is compromised or does not conform to the producer's specification, the behaviors observed in these tests are undesirable. Anyone who experiences what they believe is an adverse event, unscheduled maintenance, should, as GAMI notes here, report it to them. In their instructions for continued airworthiness, there's a website listed on how to do that. The FAA's PAFI program did put out a document of lessons learned from fuel testing over the years, and it is important to point out that they did note paint was one of their specific concerns. To go back on my earlier point about fuel trucks and fuel handle nozzles, the PAFI program has pointed out that materials compatibility is one of the issues, and I believe that should extend beyond aircraft certification. Presented here is the MSDS from Philips 100 low lead, Exxon 100 low lead, and GAMI's G100UL, so you can get an idea of the components within the fuels. I do recognize the incredibly difficult task it is to create 100 octane unleaded avgas, but after reviewing the MSDS for G100UL, I am concerned about possible human exposure to some of the contents during fueling or use of aircraft. So some closing statements and a summary. Based on my limited testing over the course of a week, valid concern exists to believe that my aircraft are not compatible with G100UL and may be damaged with use of such fuel in their current configuration. It's unclear if Viton or other suitable material replacements are approved for all components of my aircraft. It's also concerned about several other wetted fuel components and general compatibility on my aircraft that to date are not yet assessed. This includes cork gaskets on fuel senders, fuel strainer components and gaskets, fuel flow meters that may be installed, fuel bladders and existing fuel lines, including those of the wing to fuselage interconnect that may be rubber. Also windshield plastics and other items on the aircraft externally. I believe further testing of paint and wetted fuel component compatibility across the fleet is warranted, and users should perform testing if necessary before utilizing a fuel such as G100UL. Based on the testing described in this report, a service difficulty report was filed with the FAA. And lastly, I want to close with this. I personally welcome unleaded fuels, and I look forward to the day that I can utilize them when I feel that there are no adverse effects and safe for operation of my personal aircraft. After all, the FAA does rest the final authority with the owner or operator of an aircraft.